It always
Hilarious.
it always makes me laugh. So, Dr. Leslie McMurtry, University of Salford. I'm going to introduce you first. I've got here that you are a lecturer, or the lecturer, in radio studies at the University of Salford. You work on audio drama, your work on audio drama has been published in the Journal of Popular Culture, Palgrave Communications, and the Journal of Radio and Audio Media, and that you've been interviewed by The Atlantic Online and The Independent, and that you have particular areas of interest in podcasts, Gothic horror, audio drama, transmedia and adaptation studies, empirical experiments on imagery generation through aural drama, cultures of production and gender, and film and television sound. And you also write about fan studies, including Doctor Who and Gothic horror. You're quite busy, aren't you?
I am, yes. A lot of things interest me.
Definitely. And one of the reasons I'm very glad to have found you is you also talk about binaural, which is not an area I've found very easy to find a great deal on research-wise, or anywise, quite frankly. So that I'm really grateful that you're talking to me today about it. And I'll just pre-warn you, I wanted to cover some of the things I found really interested in what I've been reading is the future, obviously, of radio drama and this whole kind of radio / podcast thing. Where's it going? What's it happening? And as a screenwriter exploring this area, what are the opportunities? What should us writers be thinking of? Because I think there's a strong bias, kind of a snobbery towards audio drama, which I've become. I think I was guilty of, quite frankly, but not anymore. So it'd be nice to talk about that. And also, I'm interested in the idea of this grammar of storytelling when you bring in something like binaural immersive sound, and also what audiences, is this something that will appeal more to younger audiences who are used to gaming and having that experience? And last but not least, I was interested in what you talk about when you talk about deliberate framing errors, where the audience blur reality and fiction, and when you've listening to something that can make you physically turn round because you think something's behind you. I thought that would be interesting to have a chat about as well. And then anything else that you would like to share and that you think would be useful. So the main audience for this will probably be people interested in sound, radio, audio, but also I think they should be film, TV, because I definitely do think we need to unghetto audio and radio drama, and just last but not least to openly say that my experience so far of talking to technicians in particular, very kindly giving me their time to talk about their work with binaural. From a creative side, artists, they love it. From a technical side, wanting to get something with really clean, crisp dialogue out there, there's a less of love, shall we say, for it, and quite a lot of an encouragement to perhaps think about doing it all in stereo, mixing in Dolby stereo, and then going down to binaural. So these are all the areas that I'm exploring, and any views that you have as someone who's listened to a lot of binaural drama, that would be really appreciated in helping formulate where I go from here. So that's enough of me.
Before we sort of start, could I just ask, did you sort of find my work through the article I wrote with Alan Urett? Or sort of how did you find me?
Well, it was through the Echo Chamber book that you wrote. I read that, okay. and that was really helpful. And then very recently, discovered more about your writing, particularly around horror and mainly articles. So I've had a look at which is one of the questions I've got in a minute. Radio Gaga. 4 issues will decide the future of audio. Also, the anatomy of a game changer. I wanted to ask you around that, BBC's Radio 4's Life and Fate, just around the adaptation side, because part of my PhD, or main part actually, is creating a horror script, cinematic visual storytelling screenplay, and reimagining that as a binaural audio series, which currently looks like it's going to run to a good 10 episodes of half an hour, if I'm really succinct, because it takes longer to tell, in many ways, to tell the story in sound, I'm discovering, than audio, than visually. But also it's very exciting because you've so much freedom in the way you tell that story, which I'm really, really enjoying. And framing errors, reality and fiction in audio drama, which I thought was just very, very interesting. So I wanted to see if you could see any crossovers or relevance, and there might not be any, but I just wanted to ask you about those, really. And
okay, great, thank you.
But my first question is, what is the point of bothering with binaural? Because it is a lot of extra hassle if you want to do a broadcast quality audio drama. There's a lot of reasons not to do it.
I guess the reason to bother with it is if there's some kind of story you want to tell that you want to maybe make it a bit more lifelike. If you want to go for maybe that more immersive aspect, if you want to, yeah, I think sort of interiority, immersion are good reasons to choose it, maybe above other means of recording. I suppose if you're envisioning, and envisioning is a very vision centric word, envisioning or imagining, I guess, a very engaged audience who is willing to sort of we talk about, I guess, radio as it sort of used to be a primary medium when, before the popularization of TV. So you would supposedly put all your attention onto it. And ever since sort of the invention of the transistor radio in cars, portable radios, it's supposedly become the secondary medium, so that you hear it, but you don't listen to it, you don't pay attention to it. And of course, putting it in that sort of way is very, it doesn't give the whole picture, because even in the 1930s, 1940s, you have these anecdotes of people who would listen to their single radio set in the house, in a domestic space, as a family, but they might also be doing a puzzle together, or they might also be doing other activities. So even then, was the radio actually a primary medium? And then Danielle Hancock, who I worked with on a number of book chapters and journal articles, she discovered audio drama through smart speakers. So she got into horror drama, which was really her thing for a long time, through sort of a group listening event, and not, again, there's sort of this perception or this stereotype that everybody's doing their listening these days on headphones, but that's not necessarily the case. Now, how a listening event for binaural would be really interesting. You'd have to really make it work, you'd need to set up the speakers. So that's the case where if you had a very particular, a drama that you wanted people to experience together in as a sort of group listening event, and you had the sort of means to get them all in one space and to arrange the speakers so that it was all correctly being heard, that could really make audio drama listening an event, which might sorry.
I was just going to say, yeah, because I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm just going to mention also that you're creaking quite a lot.
It's my chair.
Oh yeah, just only because what you're saying is really important. I want everyone to be able to hear every word. As you were speaking, I'm thinking of silent discos, which are very much a joint event, but people got their own earpods in, for example. And also in the play Anna at the National, which was with binaural sound, the audience were there with their own headphones. So it was kind of true binaural, and it comes through a stereo rather than a surround sound cinematic experience, which is different, isn't it? At the end of the day, when you sit there in surround sound, you're watching an image. For me, that works fine. I don't want to have a binaural experience of the Batman. I'd much rather have Dolby surround sound. But when it comes to listening to perhaps a more intimate drama, and I want, for me, when I watched the Batman, I was still very conscious. I'm in the cinema. I was sucked into the screen in some elements, but I'm very conscious that that's there. That's my reality's over there, and I'm here. And when I listen to binaural, sometimes that's why I was interested in what you said about in your work about framing. Is I don't literally, I have found myself turn around and not known, is that bird really here, or is it over there, or is it inside the drama? And it's incredibly disorientating sometimes. And that's not what I experience when I'm in a cinema watching a film, but because the pictures are in my head rather than on a screen. I think it's important to, although I'm looking at how to link cinematic work with sort of what I call sonic cinema, I do feel that it's, when people talk about ambisonic and Dolby surround sound, they're designed to work with images and objects on a screen, whereas when we're talking about binaural audio, podcasts, radio, that is, I feel there is a big difference, isn't there, between when you're creating sound to go with an image and creating sound where the audience creates the images.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned ambisonic because I wrote an article about. Sorry, it's been a while since I thought about this. The Wolverine, the Long Night
Yes.
podcast drama, and they used ambisonic. That was kind of one of their, I guess, selling points, and so, and I kind of have mixed feelings about that use. I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not, I'm not sure if it made as big a difference to the actual product, the actual drama as maybe they expected it to. But yes, to go back to the idea of making sound to interact with an image versus telling a story purely through sonic means, and the impact that has on the picture that is generated in people's minds. Sort of assuming that people do generate images, and the sort of research that I've done and the sort of literature review kind of thing that I've done says that most people do. Most people, you can tell them to imagine a horse jumping over a barn, and they'll have never seen that in real life, but most people can imagine it. So that kind of suggests that people are capable of creating images rather than just retrieving them. So that, I think, gives a huge potential to telling stories purely by sound and using, so we say there are sort of four elements of I guess radio or audio, and you can see if you agree with this: dialogue, sound effects, music, and silence. And if you're baking a cake of audio storytelling, those are the ingredients you have. You sort of have no more than that, but how you tell the story. Yeah, okay.
Well, that brings me to binaural, because for me that adds this other level of perspective. There's and that perspective of whether it's someone standing behind you, coming up behind you, whether it's the sense of something being far away, which I know you can create a certain amount in stereo, and quite a lot, in fact. But there's just, I don't know the academic terms for it, but there's a very tangible sense of being inside the story. And that's, for me, that's the fundamental difference. Is stereo, the story's inside your head. In binaural, you are inside the story. And that's the bit that just grabs me. And I know it can be messy and awkward and difficult, but I feel that there are certain stories that could benefit from that, because as part of a story, a writer, you want to connect your audience with the story. So that's why I'm interested in exploring it as a tool, as another way, the same way in a way that a cinematographer, a DOP would use light and framing to tell the visual story on a screen. I'm interested in the idea, and I'd love to know your views on this, on using the, not the Sennheiser headphones authentic experience of walking around and hearing everything as if you're hearing it with your ears, but using the microphone. And I don't have a head because they're a little bit pricey, but I do have a Zoom H3 VR, and that, using that almost like a not a camera, but as a perspective. So sometimes your perspective will be as the listener, that you're with a particular character or in a part of the scene, and then if that moves to another perspective, the same way originally I was a film editor, so I think in that way. Whether that's actually a realistic thing that you can do successfully and have the audience follow, I don't know yet. And one of the biggest challenges I find with audio is, because my brain already knows what is supposed to be happening, I cannot tell if something's working or not. I have to keep testing everything on people who don't know anything about what's going on to be able to know, which is interesting, but there's no way around it.
Gosh, okay. So what you said there throws up a bunch of different things. So I'm sure you're being a cinema person, you're probably familiar with Michel Chion and Point of Audition.
I've,
It,
I've heard of it, but not yet gone in depth. But it's going to be added to my list right now.
okay, so there's I as a sorry, I'm creaking so much. I'll try to stop creaking my chair. As both a sort of researcher and as a writer and maker of audio drama myself, um, I've definitely, my relationship to sort of this idea of point of audition, and maybe what you're talking about here about using point of audition, or where the, as you say, not necessarily the camera, but something about positioning the listener with a certain character and hearing sort of the environment from their perspective. Um, I guess I didn't think a huge amount, or, well, I did think about it when I was starting to write scripts, but my understanding of that changed when I had to start producing scripts, producing my own work. Well, I didn't have to, but I decided to produce my own work, or at least try to. And I think, in my experience, like, I always now try to think spatially about how a scene is set up. And um, so I'll come back to that in a second, but I just want to introduce something else, which when I was talking about the imagery generation research, Emma Rodero has done some qualitative and quantitative sort of research to find out what makes people pay attention in sort of audio drama, and what makes, so these sort of experiments are done, people sort of report back what they have, they think they have found makes them pay attention. There's also been experiments done where people's heart rates are measured to see, if something is affecting them on that level. Also, they do skin conductance tests, so they see, like, if your palms start to sweat, kind of thing. So all these different methods of trying to determine how people are affected by audio stimulus. And Emma Rodero found out that there tends to be more sort of interest from, if the piece includes dialogue rather than just one person reading, if it includes sound effects, if it includes music, but also, and this is what's crucial to what you were just saying, if there's a sense of spatiality, and that sort of comes to what you're saying about placing someone within the drama rather than the drama happening inside their head, which I think is a really great way of articulating that. So that makes a lot of sense. So trying to go back to what I was saying, um, I do think in a lot of circumstances that, trying to put the listener in that perspective and in a particular character's perspective and making it possible to hear those shifts can be really valuable. I do think it does have the potential to be confusing, but I'm not going to I don't think that's not a reason to try, if that makes sense.
Well, I tested out with you. I've been doing some test recordings. Did you get a chance to have a listen?
I did.
Did it? What were the if any, were there any particular perspectives that you were aware of whilst you were listening to that short 3.5 minutes?
Well, the perception I got was that it was outdoors. Um, I could hear the sort of cat moving. I imagined a character being outside with a cat, and the cat was sort of um, moving around the character that we were hearing the perspective from. Um, so that was my.
And before the cats purring around their head, with the rustling sound, was it obvious or completely not obvious that they were climbing a tree to get to the cat?
It was not obvious. I
So,
I was obviously aware of the my this character that I'm sort of in the position of their breathing and how that was changing. Um, so it was obviously some kind of physical exertion, but I guess I hadn't quite understood that I was supposed to be climbing a tree.
so it wasn't a sense of it coming towards that you're
Uh,
aware of.
not no, not so
No.
much.
And this is the challenge, because when you know that, it's very clear that they're coming, because it's that you can hear the perspective the further down, and the crunches get louder and stuff. But unless you can set a scene up in a way that the audience know where their starting point is, this is the it feels a little bit like when they first decided to do close-ups, and everyone's like, oh, no one will know they've got any feet.
Mm-hmm.
But and of course in that case they were fine, but this isn't so easy to do, and it does cause confusion. So if you have any not necessarily right now, but any useful leads on how that can be achieved, or anyone who's really looked into that, I would love to have access to that, because that's one of the main advantages of the binaural, but to get it to work is extremely difficult. And inside a studio, I did a studio version as well, which sounded quite very acceptable as being outside, except you can tell when dialogue it doesn't have the background stuck on it. So there's something about the dialogue when you listen to it actually outside that you really know you're outside, and I think that's very difficult to fake. But the other thing in a studio, you've got this sort of dead sound, whereas outside, if perspective is what's important, I'm finding that again, do it for all the problems it creates. At least outside you can get a greater sense of distance, but they're obviously not in the version that I sent you. But those things aside, but thank you very much for giving that feedback. I thought I might make the most of it while you're there, as you don't know anything about the project. I wanted to go with your article, Radio Gaga. You talk about the key to radio has always been its ability to adapt to changing social and technological situations. So more than 8 decades later, this is, was it 2018, radio is still reaching 89% of the adult population of the UK, and that's 44.8 million people. And so I wanted to know if you could update us on, you don't have to have the stats to hand, But obviously with COVID, people having earplugs and earphones more commonly now, I'm suspecting that it's even more a time for audio drama, and certainly the interest in audio drama seems to have grown, but the output hasn't kept pace with it, has it? Or at least not on traditional
Well,
outlets.
it's this weird thing of every few years you'll get an article in the sort of popular press saying, "Oh, look, audio drama, it's new and it's amazing, and why have we never heard of it before?" So it keeps getting reinvented, whereas people who have been making audio drama for decades sort of feel. I mean, it's obviously nice to get the exposure, and to the more listeners, the better. But it does sort of feel like it's reinventing the wheel all the time. Um, but yeah, I think it's a really good point, because there have been discussions for years, for decades, as sort of podcasting became more mainstream in the last, I guess, 15 years now. Um, you know, most people will still think of a podcast as a chat cast or a chumcast, which is, the sort of I'm talking into a microphone, and I'm just talking at you, with whatever niche subject I'm talking about, or I might have a co-host, or I might have interviews and guests, and that's sort of what most people think of when they think of podcasts. Not a lot of people proportionately will think, oh yeah, we can listen to a drama. And it's strange. I teach a module called Radio Cultures, for undergraduate students in BA in television radio production, and I taught it last year. And these students who are learning about radio and radio production, a lot of them want to have jobs in the industry. They were a bit amazed that radio drama still existed. So if they're amazed, then it is a bit of an uphill battle. So I think, ironically, the sort of community of audio drama, or the industry of audio drama, has a sort of image problem, in the sense that so much is being generated all the time, um, but it just isn't. I guess not going mainstream, but it just isn't getting the same. Like, it would be amazing, I think, someday to get a sort of service like, Netflix will give you, it's sort of algorithms for you to decide. Well, not for you to decide, recommendations on what to listen to next, and we're sort of missing something like that for
Yeah.
audio drama. So I guess it is a case of, it's there. There's so much of it. It's all there to discover, um, but it still isn't quite in the mainstream vocabulary of most people.
And also, there is a bit of a lag, isn't there? Because unless it's changed very recently, when I tried to upload a binaural test work up onto Audible for Spotify for podcasters, which is and they basically killed the binaural in the upload. So I ended up putting it on YouTube, which doesn't kill the binaural. So there's still there's this. I think there's still an obsession, a focus on surround immersive sound to do with films, what you're seeing, but actually a bit of a lag with the idea of using it, which would seems illogical to me for audio drama. Do you think that's true, and do you think, if it is true, that it's because people in audio drama have a certain way of they're used to doing things? There's this quality threshold of how they want things to sound, and that it's a bit like when you do binaural. It's a bit like when people first started making films on their phones or with little homemade cameras, and it was seen as a sort of mad indie thing, but not what you'd want to put on the big screen.
Maybe there's a bit of that. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons for this. I think because audio drama now is so like accessible, in terms of pretty much anyone can make it and upload it. And I think not everyone necessarily wants to invest in the technology to make at the time, I suppose. So, and the podcast drama, I guess, very, very generally has been dominated in a lot of areas by certain kinds of drama that is not that interested in the spatial aspect. I guess it's more interested in telling stories. Very much, I guess. In one of my um, journal articles, I think I called it post serial um, audio drama. And it's very much molded on the sort of true crime podcasts, which have some sound design aspects to them, of course, but they are mostly focused on voices telling stories, which so I think that mode got very popular and has been very influential. Of course, there's tons of drama that does not follow that sort of approach. So I think a lot of it is sort of just what you're used to hearing. Um, and I suppose it's a little, I think you were alluding to this, it's a little bit guided by what people in the industry think and want to do. I think BBC radio drama and BBC Sounds have the opportunity to do sort of more experimentation, and they've released some like binaural versions of things that they just broadcast in normal stereo.
But haven't they done those in post production? I
Oh,
thought that was there because they have that infrastructure for you or I to to hire a sound designer. You probably do your own sound design, but if a sound designer and for them to do it all in post production is very different from the BBC. But they seems to be a general bit of advice I'm being given is don't just do it in stereo and then maybe mix in Dolby and surround sound, get it just how you want, and then export it as binaural. So I don't know if that's what the BBC have done, but I definitely read somewhere that they're using panning in post. They're not recording it natively, if you like, and it's very understandable why. And certainly some of the binaural productions I've listened to recently, my guess is, until I can find out otherwise, is that that's what they have done. And do you think it sounds the same if you could do it in post, or is it purely my imagination that it doesn't feel the same as if it's done live with a microphone that is recording binaural at source? Because it's hard to know whether I'm imagining it or whether it's real. This is the dilemma I'm in at this stage.
I think certain people's audio perception is more nuanced than others, and I get, yeah, this is a bit embarrassing to admit, I guess, but I love audio drama, but I would say my perception is not as keen as some other people's, and sometimes I don't notice things like that. So whether I'm typical or atypical, I couldn't tell you.
Well, that's it. It's such a broad such a broad audience that when it's appearing to. And you mentioned ambisonic earlier. One bit of advice I've had is to record in ambisonic and then export as binaural, because that gives you a bit of help with any sort of dialogue that's head's moved a little bit, and it sounds very sensible. Is it the same when you record in ambisonic and then mix down to binaural as if you've recorded in binaural, as far as you are aware? I don't know the biology of it, but it doesn't quite make sense to me. But again, I don't have the science yet to know whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't know either. I have colleagues who are, I guess, more technical than I am, and I think they might argue that it does make a difference. But and I'm happy to put you in touch
I
with
would
them.
love to speak to them, absolutely. And it could be that is there an argument to make, again, this comes down to the perception of radio and podcasts as for kind of mass audience on the whole. But if it was to go more niche, do you think there is room to have productions where not everybody's going to get every aspect of it, but as long as the story's good, they can hear, they understand what's going on, that's good enough for the mass, and it might be there's other elements that other people will pick up. So even with binaural, everyone's head shape is different. So there's always going to be differences. You're never going to get something that's completely comprehensible to everybody the way you would need it if it's coming out the car radio on Radio 4 in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a sensible approach. If you can design something that can be enjoyed on multiple levels, I think, yeah, that might be the way forward.
And do you think there is anything on to ask you about the idea of the grammar of audio storytelling, which is, as you know well, is very different from when you're writing a visual screenplay, and that sort of use of sound effects with a greater sense of movement and placement of where the listener is. So using all of that with binaural as your main sort of tool, if you like, do you think it can impact the way stories are told, or is it just basically a gimmick?
I think it can impact the way stories are told. I think from the way you were describing earlier about turning around and being like, was that a sound, like, was that creak in my house or was it in this drama? I think that's really effective. So again, I think for sort of, as you say, putting a person into a drama, and if you're doing that where it's a very specific setting, maybe that you want to replicate, I think that that's worthwhile, making that sort of labor and thought intensive investment in positioning sound effects very precisely. The one thing I will say as a writer of audio drama, and then again sort of a producer and having other people produce my work, is I've noticed over the years I will imagine a very precise sort of series and collage of sound effects and layering of sound, and I will think, as I've written this on the page, I have conveyed this exactly as I hear it in my own head. And then even when it's myself who's then the producer trying to realize this, often what I think is very fluent and sort of clear storytelling from a sort of sound effects point of view, when I try to make that happen in the actual production, it's not as clear, and sometimes it's not clear at all. So that may be my limitation as a writer and a producer, but I think that's
I think it is just the dilemma of everybody who's trying. This is what I'm struggling with so much. I think it's incredibly difficult, and actually that brings up an interesting point, because as a screenwriter, I might have a visual in my head, but I don't tell the director how to direct it. With audio writing, you're putting minimal effects, and actually I'm finding it's really important to go out and mess around with the microphone and test things out, because it's changing. I then adapt the script because of that, and I feel there's a real, again, I think this is an opportunity for writers who are interested in getting more involved in the making of things, even if they're not going to be the actual director or even the final producer, that it's really important to go out and mess about with the mics and get a sense of what you can do and what you can't, and have that practical experience. I mean, obviously that's also good on film sets, but I think it's particularly important because it may change the way you set up a scene. So, for example, if you've got a scene that's very tense and you've got someone who's perhaps a malevolent character, and the way they're moving around you, this is with binaural, and you're from your perspective, they're moving around, maybe they come up behind you to talk, and it can be quite subtle that if you said to the person afterwards, oh, where were they moving, they wouldn't, they're not, you don't want them to be most that conscious of it, but it may still make the hairs on the back of the neck turn up, and they know it's that feeling that something's not right, and it's a creating tension using the spatial awareness as well as what the dialogue might be and the silences and the music and the effects, which is for me feels more sort of what I call sonic cinema. Is that something that you think is something that could well be explored, and would you agree that it's good for writers of radio to have to mess around and experience how difficult it is to achieve this, because otherwise you'll write it in there in your head, and then some person, board director's got to try and make it happen, and they haven't got a chance in hell, and they're going to then have to change it, and then you're going to be upset as a writer that they've completely changed the way that you did the scene. Sorry, that was a very long question.
No, yeah, I absolutely 100% agree. And that's one of the reasons I love audio drama so much, because there is that opportunity and really strong incentive to like I say, with my own experience, I've written things, and similar to you, I've tried to realize them, and have come to understand that the way I've written it isn't quite right, so I need to adapt it. And having the freedom to do that is just amazing. I can't think of really any other medium that you can do that, and I think personally, it's improved me as a writer, and I guess it creates this virtuous cycle of I think I become a better writer the more I play around with having to produce things, and then that makes it keeps going, and it's the experimental nature of it. Making your own sounds are if you're doing it in a sort of Foley way, is really educational. But yeah, just going out into the natural world and capturing sounds is very inspirational, and it does, for someone who is a creative storyteller. It can really influence the direction your writing goes into, and yeah, I guess, I mean, I will have to maybe have another conversation if I ever produce someone else's work, because it could be that the way the dialogues I have with myself in my own head between writer me and producer me, if I'm producing someone else's work, don't it's not quite the same quality, and not quite the same carte blanche to do what you want with it. So, but yeah, to return to your question, I think it's a great opportunity, and I think as a writer of audio drama, there's no reason you shouldn't have a play around with doing the production side, because it makes you a better creative person, and it makes you a better writer, and it opens you up to lots of possibilities.
And can you share some of the things that you learnt through those experiences? Can you give us, even if it's one or two examples? That'd be really interesting.
Okay, I'll try. So the only reason I started producing my work was because I got I got an artist residency at the Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and the project was to write an audio drama based on that setting. But I didn't realize, sort of when I got it, that they wanted me to produce the final project as well. So not just write it, but make the thing. So I had to kind of I didn't have enough time during the residency to do anything more than really write the script. I recorded some things, which I later used, but I had to do pretty much all the other production work um, after I'd gone away from the Badlands. So before I embarked on actually making that project, because it was quite a long script, it was like 20-minute, 30-minute script, which in audio terms is long.
Yeah.
um, as you know, having done your 3 minute test, that's probably tons of work just to
Yep.
go into those 3 minutes. Yeah. um, so I thought, well, let me write and produce something first that's very short. Again, I think it was about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and and start understanding what it is to go from writing something to producing something. So I wrote something called a cup clinking because I wanted to explore the idea of, um, if you hear a cup clinking, can you tell what kind of cup it is simply by hearing it? And, what kind of associations does it create in your own mind? How do you visualize that cup based on your past experience? And it was just like it had sort of a sci-fi element too, because so it's a dialogue between a cup and a kettle, and they're in a kitchen, and then they talk about, oh well, what if we're actually not in a kitchen, what if we're on Mars? And so I had to create the soundscape of being on Mars. But the main thing, to try to answer your question, is I thought, okay, I will demonstrate sonically that we're in a kitchen. And how can I do that? Okay, well, I have the sound of a kettle boiling. So I went out and I have a Zoom H1, and I recorded a kettle boiling. And then I thought, in the script I had, oh, we could hear the clicks of a dog's toenails on the linoleum of a floor as the dog comes into the kitchen and goes away. And actually, well, first of all, I didn't have a dog to record that sound. And actually, trying to put that in to realize it, I thought, are the audience going to understand what that sound is without any kind of, like, okay, maybe I can make the dog bark, but maybe I don't want to. Maybe it's not, so I discarded that sort of sonic image, and I can't remember what I used instead. I think I focused mainly on sort of the kettle sounds, and there was a clock in this particular kitchen, so we could hear the clock ticking. I ended up having to use sort of diegetic music, that was treated to sound as if it was coming out of a radio, to again sort of create this image of somebody's kitchen. So I think that that example goes back to this idea of me thinking, oh yes, this sound is perfect, and it's probably a really nice sound of the dog's toenails on the linoleum, but is it going to be identifiable to an audience? It doesn't matter that much for that particular scene. It didn't, so I got rid of it. Excuse me. So, um, is that is that
It,
what you're looking
um,
for?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and yes, exactly. So you'll put something in a script, and but then now I mean, this is already happening to me. I'm thinking, well, that's like I've got a butterfly in mine. There is no sound for a butterfly, really. Not that sounds that you could actually use, and so the workaround for that will be, it's just a rough guide in what you heard, but there'll be basically a musical butterfly effect, because trying to make everything else I've tried just sounds awful. When you actually mix it in, it sounds great in the studio when you're listening to it, but it doesn't work in practice. So I think it's that, finding out. But I just want also to ask you again about the framing errors. So where the audience sort of blur reality with fiction, and you've written about that and the way it's done in two different podcasts, and one, as I remember it, is the sense as that the audience are there, kind of there, present, but they're not, as they are in the other podcast, where they're literally inside the head of inside a head, and they've got a very very specific perspective, and I was just interested in any comments based on what we've been chatting about that idea of audio positioning, and because I think that's key to making binaural a useful tool, and clarify and getting some clarity on that.
So, I've done a lot more work with what I was calling framing errors. I wrote a book chapter for the Routledge Companion to Radio and Podcast Studies, which is all about blurring blurring fictional and non-fictional lines in audio drama. Well, audio drama, audio comedy, sort of from the 1920s till now. Um, and but specifically with your what you're asking about audio positioning and how that might impact that sort of device or approach. Um, well, I think what you've not asked me so much right now about sort of the horror genre,
Not
but
specifically. I mean, that was obviously the examples that you were giving in the article I read.
right. Because one thing I can think that might be relevant to what you're asking. I've been reading and working with an academic at Auburn University in Alabama named Matthew Kilmeyer, and he's done a lot on sort of old time radio horror. But why I'm bringing it up is because, and it's I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember the exact terms, but he's taking terms from sort of narrative and talking about how audio is the perfect medium for conveying, well, being, and this goes back to audio positioning, hearing voices of characters that may or may not actually exist, and or some characters can hear them but other characters can't, regardless of whether they can be seen. It's more about sort of their presence. So I think sort of that can potentially um, be an interesting approach to this blurring the lines between fiction and reality, these sort of framing errors. Um, because, and actually, binaural is maybe a great way to do that, because if you have a sort of, it's almost like a bait and switch, maybe, where you've got a narrative that seems to be focused in one area, but maybe you're planting these sort of almost subliminal sound effects somewhere in there that the listener may not at first even be aware of, but then they start to think, well, am I actually hearing this? Is it in my environment? What does this mean? That could be, I guess, one really effective way to approach that.
That's really interesting. I'd love to read more of that, and also because the next thing the horror project I'm working on, I've got a deaf character who's speaking with their hands. So in the sense their voice is sometimes reflected off the other characters responding to them, where you work out what they're saying through that. Other times exploring them, there is an actual voiceover, but the voiceover is really in the head of the one character who actually understands them and represents part of their connection. So again, this is why there's all this positioning. This is why this is really interesting for me, because to have a kind of proper geography of how to do this in a way that's consistent and won't lose the audience is fairly critical to the success. So I'd love to get that. And before you go, can you tell me where can we hear your audio work that you've written and that you produced?
Okay, so I'm on SoundCloud. My production company is called Lesser of Two Weevils. So that would be the place to find it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And have you got anything else to say to anyone who's thinking, oh, I don't know, binaural sounds interesting, but is it worth the hassle? Would you encourage them, or say don't bother unless you've don't bother unless you're doing horror and you want that kind of effect? Or do you think it does have somewhere to some way to influence the way we create more of an audience, really, for audio and podcasts and drama ongoing?
Yeah, I'd say don't discount it. I'd say listen, try to seek out productions that have been made that way and make your own decision. Um, but definitely don't, this, I guess, this sort of received wisdom that you seem to be coming up against of don't bother with it because it's very labor intensive, and I think you were saying people are calling it messy. Um, you know, I don't think that's any reason not to try it. I wouldn't be discouraged by that. And I'm all for experimenting, trying new ways of making things, especially audio drama, because it does tend, for some reason, it's tended. Well, I guess just sort of inertia. People find it sort of fixed in one area, and then there's a lot of imitation, and maybe that is one reason it's not gotten higher profile than it has. But I really think there's merit in your idea of creating productions that work on multiple levels, so that if you are someone who really does appreciate these finer nuances of binaural and spatiality, that you can enjoy it on that level versus other people who may be just more interested in the storytelling. I've sort of never heard anyone articulate that sort of middle space before, and I think there's a lot of potential there.